Where is he? Adnan.
Yeah, yeah. I forgot.
Yeah.
I was wondering. Well, I'm Peri-Urban. I'm Director of Comparative Urban Studies here at the Wilson Center, and I have one very brief, very pleasant task, which is to introduce Caroline Cajato, who is the chair of the session today, and will be making the other introductions. This session is a second day of a meeting we had yesterday examining human security in the city, and a number of the participants in that smaller meeting are here today on the panel and in the audience. And I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting and fascinating conversation. It really is a pleasure anytime I have the opportunity to be in the room with Carolyn. We participated in editing a volume on urban diversity a number of years ago. And it's a volume we're very proud of, particularly since the subject is quite contentious, and the group was quite contentious, so that produced an interesting volume. And she is here today as representing Urban Landmark. She's a regional coordinator in Pretoria, and we've worked in the past together, and it's always a pleasure to welcome her back to the Wilson Center to Washington. Some of you may know she was at Georgetown last year, so she's familiar with DC, and I want to just welcome her and turn the floor over to her.
Thank you, Blair, and it's always a pleasure to be back at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and also to discuss and debate and engage around urban issues, which are becoming highly contentious, but also are very significant in trying to understand our world and how and its future. Today we're talking about peri-urban spaces. The spaces at the edge of our city, which are some of the fastest growing areas in the global south. But little is known about these spaces where rural migrants looking for a foothold in the city and middle-class households leaving the city for affordable land meet. What we do know is that these areas present new and hybridized forms of regulation and governance. They present fragmented authorities and institutions, which overturn how we understand urban governance, the role of the state in urban development, planning, and finance. Yet the sheer scale of these spaces and the rates of growth mean that we can no longer ignore them or seek conventional interventions to address the challenges that they present. They're not merely the edges of the city, shaped by a strong center, but we think that they are shaping the nature of the center and urbanization more generally. Today we're lucky to have 4 experienced panelists. I know we only have 3, but we hope that Adnan will join us pretty soon, who will look at these peri-urban areas in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. To my right is Daniel Nkum, who is a senior lecturer and director of the spring program at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Kumasi in Ghana. Daniel is a Ghanaian national who obtained his doctoral degree at the Technical University of Dortmund in Germany and has also pursued courses in forest policy analysis at the European Forest Institute in Finland, international development studies at the University of Oslo in Norway, and organization and systems development at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland in Ohio, USA. Daniel today presents his talk on land management, social conflict, and the city. Our next speaker, who sits right next to Daniel, is Jeremy Gerlich. He's an expert in emerging markets bond financing and was raised in New York. He received an undergraduate degree from the Johns Hopkins University and Peabody Conservatory, majoring in international studies and music performance and minoring in economics and entrepreneurship. He received his master's degree from the School of Advanced International Studies, focusing on international economics and European studies with a concentration in emerging markets. Jeremy today presents his talk on opportunities in municipal finance, lessons for peri-urban areas. He's currently working with the mayor of Dakar on financing or finding ways of raising bonds for the city. So I think we look forward to seeing what Jeremy has to say about financing these peri-urban spaces and what opportunities exist for that. Adicia Fernandez will talk about old and new peri-urban zones, questions and challenges from the Latin American experience. Adicia has an LLB from the Minas Gerais. Oh dear. I can do German. I don't know about the Spanish. But anyway, about the somewhere in Brazil. He's got an LLM in law and development in from Warwick University in the UK, and a PhD from the same university. He's a Brazilian lecturer, researcher, and legal consultant based in the UK. He's currently a member of DPU Associates, the Development Planning Unit of the University College of London in the UK, and of the teaching faculty of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, MAMS, USA. We're very pleased to have you. Welcome, Adnan.
I'm sorry, my apologies.
That's all right, that's all right. Adnan Morshed is at the School of Planning and Architecture at the Catholic University. His presentation today will be on the post-marginality margins. Adnan received his PhD from MIT's History, Theory, and Criticism section of architecture. He's currently professor at the School of Architecture and Planning at Catholic University, and has served on the board of the Society of Architectural Historians from 2006 to 2009, and on the jury of the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Fellowship. Welcome. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's give the floor to, I think, Dan, do you want to start? Or how is it going to go? Yeah.
Want me to go first, Fernanda?
Okay. Adicia will go first.
Yes, so good morning. I'd like to thank Caroline and the Woodrow Wilson Institute. It's a pleasure to be back here discussing one of the most interesting topics of the more recent agenda on urban studies, policymaking, and urban management throughout Latin America, which is the emergence of a new wave of urban development, no longer around capital cities or the traditional metropolitan regions, but this time around the smaller cities, middle-sized cities, and even small cities, right? So the phenomenon of the formation and proliferation of peri-urban zones is not a recent phenomenon in Latin America, although there's a new development. But I find it always interesting to look at Latin America exactly because it's a more consolidated, established process of urbanization, because it can shed light on more recent, processes taking place in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and even in Eastern European countries. So what I'll be presenting to you is these two movements of one same overall pattern of urban development in Latin America. Traditionally, the formation of peri-urban zones around, capital cities, metropolitan regions, and more recently, new forms of peri-urban zones being formed, being identified in other parts of the countries. As a result of both movements, in fact, certainly we have very dynamic areas, very vibrant communities, but it needs to be said that the overall development model determining the expansion of urban development in the periphery is highly unsustainable in social, political, economic, as well as fiscal terms. So there is a widespread crisis of land governance in old and new peri-urban zones, and my argument is that we urgently need to conceive and implement an integrated land governance framework to tackle the problems resulting from this kind of urban development. I mean, what do I call the older peri-urban zones? I mean, as you know, urbanization has long consolidated in Latin America. We are talking about 80% of people living in urban areas. In Brazil, it's 84% of people living in urban areas. And this has long been a process of metropolitanization. In many cases, only a primary metropolitan region. In other cases, several metropolitan regions, usually around capital cities. But the pattern has been the same, one of profound social spatial segregation. So what we see throughout Latin America is that the main cities, they combine an enormous housing deficit with also a staggering number of vacant service land, as well as a gigantic stock of either empty, abandoned, or underutilized properties, be they public or private. I mean, in the case of Brazil, for example, we have a housing deficit of 6.5 million units, but at the same time, we have almost 5.5 million vacant built properties. And also, on average, 20% of vacant service land in the main cities. So, also, given the elitist nature of state action in the process, a huge concentration of infrastructure, services, and equipment in few parts of the main cities, generating a gigantic backlog of urban environmental problems, especially these days concerning sanitation, transportation, and mobility, and urban security. It should be stressed that urban development historically has basically meant the same as informal development. Informality is structural. It's not just an exception, it's not marginal, it is the main way the main Latin American cities have been formed. And unlike the US, where one associates the notion of suburbs with the middle and upper classes, in the Latin American experience, most informal settlements were developed in the periphery of the main cities. You do come across more centrally located informal settlements, which is the case of the favelas in many Brazilian cities, but as a rule, informal settlement has taken place in the periphery of the main cities. And also, combined, I mean, the processes of informal development, they have provided more and better opportunities of access to land and housing to the urban poor than the public policies and official markets combined. It should be stressed that they have played a fundamental role in enabling the poor to have access to land and housing in the main areas. So generating highly dynamic areas, vibrant communities, but again, a widespread problem of lack of security of tenure and high environmental, social, political, and economic costs, right? So what we've seen over the last 20 years or so in the main urban areas throughout Latin America is that there has been a process of increasing commodification. So capitalist production in the post-industrial period not only takes place in the city, but it's also the capitalist production of the city. The growth of the construction sector, both informally and formally, is breaking all sorts of records. We have figures indicating internationally that over the last 50 years, more houses were built than in the 5,000 years before, right? So the number of houses being built, especially through informal processes, is staggering, and there's a growing penetration of national and global land and property capital markets, leading to all sorts of increasing land, property, and rental values in the main cities in Latin America. Many old centers have systematically been losing population, but there has been a process of further peripherization of the poor. Even the more recent favelas no longer take place or are developed in central areas. Even the more recent favelas can only be established in the periphery of the main cities these days. So, and another recent development is that for the first time, the rich and the poor are disputing the space in the periphery because of the proliferation of gated communities. So very often you come across these two new forms of development, informal development in the periphery plus gated communities disputing the same space. So the eviction game is back. I mean, eviction is something that we associated with the 70s and early 80s in Latin America, but the numbers are very shocking at the moment. I mean, be it eviction by landowners, eviction by the public authorities, usually within the context of large-scale projects, infrastructure development, sports events such as the World Cup and the Olympic Games, urban renewal programs, or be it eviction by the market, as a result of the gentrification of more central areas. Regularization programs of informal settlements have also fomented, increasing land prices leading to eviction by the market. Governmental subsidies like the gigantic housing projects being built in Mexico, Chile, or even in Brazil also leading to increasing land prices and thus determining many forms of eviction. So basically this is what has been happening with the old urban areas, right? But there's something new, which is the development of new peri-urban zones, no longer around capital cities or the usual metropolitan regions. The rates of urban growth throughout Latin America have been declining, but they're still high. What is changing is the pattern of migration. Fewer people heading towards capital cities and the usual metropolitan regions, and more people heading towards middle-sized and small cities. Then the new frontier for urban development being the Amazon, with ongoing rates of 7% a year of urban development, right? So a new system of cities is clearly being formed with a different logic, but again, deeply marked by the expansion of new peri-urban zones. And if you want to have more detail, the New York Times since January has been running a series of articles on the way the new paths of migration have been reshaping Latin America, especially in the context of Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador. But this is also, a phenomenon that can be identified in many other Latin American countries. So basically, what has been determining this new wave of urban development no longer around the traditional urban centers. Again, economic, social, political, and cultural. Rural, urban, 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 national and international migration, changes in agricultural production, national and international search for mineral resources, better infrastructure, also more available information technology, especially attracting young people who are now living towards urban areas, industrial relocation strategies, displacement by conflict, which is very much the case of Colombia, where hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced by domestic conflict, prohibitively high land prices, making it impossible for people to find a place to live in the central areas, even in smaller cities, even in middle-sized cities. Money laundering seems to have been a significant factor in many of the cases, although it needs to be further discussed. And almost to finish, there have been growing disputes over the use of land. I mean, affecting water reservoirs, natural vegetation, green belts, the encroaching of farming land, determining higher costs of food production, the impact of infrastructure projects such as airports and others, land grabbing of all sorts, a widespread acquisition of coastal land, unlicensed industrial activities. So this, has been a very serious process that has been identified in many Latin American countries, generating all sorts of negative implications. But what needs to be said is that, again, this new process is also essentially informal, if not illegal, right? Largely, these new forms of peri-urban development, they are informal. But what needs to be also stressed is that poverty does not explain it all. The rates of informal development have been higher than the rates of urban development as well as the rates of poverty growth. So one cannot explain the whole process of informality only by referring to poverty. There's a lot to be said about the way land policy and the whole organization of space is promoted, especially at the local level by the municipalities. So the new peri-urban zones, for all their dynamism, you know, they are expressions of an old, long-standing, unsustainable model of urban development. So even though policymakers should keep, you know, dreaming of the notion of compact cities, the fact is that urban expansion is there. It seems to be an imperative process, and they should try and contain and divert the process as much as they can, while at the same time anticipating that urban expansion is happening and preparing for that. So finally, from the viewpoint of a legal scholar, what I think it's important to stress is that from a legal viewpoint, these new areas, the peri-urban areas, more so than the peri-urban areas of the traditional urban development model, they are a no one's land. They are a legal limbo in that there's no dominant or, you know, significant legal technical treatment of this process of urban expansion. Municipalities have been freely manipulating their boundaries so as to generate more income through property taxation, no territorial control or licensing of many of the activities I meant, lots of authority conflicts, also given the interference from higher governmental levels, profound governance voids, and a total failure of a political representation of the population living in these peri-urban zones. So that's why I think it's crucial that we discuss the terms of an integrated land governance legal framework. So a land framework in order to democratize the conditions of access to service, land, and housing, and provide security of tenure, articulating land, urban, housing, fiscal, environmental policies, articulating preventive policies with regularization policies. Rural policies also are fundamental, you know, to be articulated together with urban policies. There has been in many places, especially in Colombia and in Brazil, a revival of urban planning, albeit on a different base, a more participatory approach and a more a sharper understanding of planning, not only as a form of regulation, but as a form of inducing some of the market movements. And finally, also in a combined manner, a governance framework, a land framework as well as a governance framework. Capacity building at the local level is an enormous challenge, but that said, it's also crucial to improve the conditions of intergovernmental articulation. We can not talk only about municipal empowerment. We need to think in terms of intergovernmental articulation, the involvement of the private and community sectors in land management, at the same time that we open up the way for popular participation in decision-making and lawmaking. And a crucial dimension, which has been long neglected, is that of the financing of urban development. Who pays for that and how? So how to improve conditions of taxation with other forms of capture of land surplus value. So finally, my point is that the new peri-urban areas, as much as the old ones, they require a new social political pact to recognize the positive dimensions of this process, the vibrancy of the communities, the dynamism of these processes, but at the same time to minimize all the negative implications, to promote better conditions of social-spatial integration and a fairer distribution of the costs and benefits of urban development. This is what, in the context of Latin America, has been increasingly called the right to the city. There is a growing social political mobilization calling for the materialization of this notion of the right to the city, which is very much, you know, a legal institution expression of this social political pact necessary to promote a more inclusive social spatial pact as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Odysseus. I think I'll call Jeremy to make his presentation.
morning, everybody. Thank you, Caroline, for the introduction, and thank you to the Wilson Center for having me here to speak about municipal finance and the lessons from municipal finance that can be translated and transferred to peri-urban areas. Just a little bit more about my background. After graduating from SAIS, I worked on Wall Street in New York, and then I was in London doing bond origination for Latin America, and then subsequently for Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And so I come to this question from a far more technical perspective than an academic perspective. And I think that the lessons that I've learned are ones that can be easily transferred to a lot of different places in emerging markets. So without further ado, I do want to, the way that I like to do a presentation is assume that nobody knows about the subject area I'm talking about. I'm sure that some of you have a good wealth of information and knowledge about municipal finance, but for those of you who don't, I want to start from a very rudimentary and fundamental level in the discussion. So in order to really move through talking about municipal finance, one of the things that needs to be considered is the way that government funds its expenditure. And looking at that, you look at the government revenue, first as far as taxes, and I have a list of the different types of taxes: stamp duty, excise tax, sales tax, road tax, income tax for either corporate or individual entities. Non-tax revenue from intra-government transfers or inter-government transfers, and then finally from government borrowing, loans and bonds. And loans and bonds are what we'll be discussing for the most part of my presentation. Effectively, the way that I look at a government is a business, and a government needs to generate sufficient revenue in order to cover its operating expenses. Once those expenses are covered, the next level is looking at the needs and desires of your community, of your constituency. And within your constituency, there'll be certain things that are easily financed and certain things that are more difficult to finance. And the problem is trying to figure out the best way to finance those different things, those different investment needs for your entity. And again, I look at the concept of a city as a political unit the way that I look at a sovereign entity, a sovereign government, again, as a political unit, same way that a peri-urban area, if it was enclosed into a governmental unit, could be looked at the same way. In order to identify what emerging markets are, though, I wanted to include a slide talking about the accepted criteria for looking at emerging markets, being that there's an increased volatility of macroeconomic performance, increased price elasticity of demand for some essential services, relatively short periods over which reliable financial information and performance data have been collected and reported, and relatively less well-developed legal and regulatory systems governing the delivery of essential services and powers at different levels of government. In looking at the concept, though, of where the funding comes from, oftentimes you need to start somewhere. And if we're looking at the municipality as the borrower or the recipient of funds, we need to look at the stages of development of the economics and financial system. The first place that a municipality will receive its money from in emerging markets most likely is the central government. Central government will be conducting transfers from the money that it receives back to the municipality. From there, there'll be bank lending. And bank lending takes the form either of development bank lending or commercial bank lending. And it's an interesting phenomenon. Right now, as Caroline said, I'm the city of Dakar's lead technical person for preparing the city for a potential bond issuance. This bond issuance will be the first issuance in the West African Francophone region, and there have been a lot of false starts from a lot of different cities that haven't gone anywhere, oftentimes because there's just not the technical capacity or capability to move things forward, sometimes because of questions of the financial ability and debt service capacity of that municipality. The goal, at least as far as I think, and we discussed this yesterday, and I think that there were some differences of opinion, is to be advanced enough that you can use, as a municipality, any one of those three tools to raise money, whether it be through the bond market, whether it be through loans from commercial or development banks, or to have expectations of regular financing from your central government. One of the things that I think is important to consider is looking at bonds versus loans. And my argument always is better to have more tools than fewer tools. Loans are are financial instruments that are originated within a bank and are often bilateral loans between the bank as the lender and the municipality as the borrower. Whereas bonds are much more contingent on the demand and appetite of the entire investor pool. Interest rates are, as far as a bond, are far more dependent on the creditworthiness of the issuer, whereas loans depend on commercial lending rates. Maturities, as far as bonds are concerned, often are much longer and can match the useful life of specific projects, whereas loans have shorter maturities, and collateral is often required for loans, whereas not required for bonds. Problems with bonds, though, are that they're high cost, especially for first-time issuers. There is also a perception that there's an incredible amount of risk for emerging markets countries and for municipalities or political units within those countries even more so. And that most significantly, there's often a very volatile market with extremely limited liquidity. So if you look at the liquidity issue, there are problems for the issuer. They're not going to necessarily be able to place their bond, and once the bond is placed in the primary market, there's very limited trading on the secondary market. Nonetheless, with all of that said, there's been an explosion of bond issuance, particularly in West Africa. And again, my experiences, while I've had them in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Eastern Europe, I want to focus on Western Europe because that's where I have the most recent data. If you look in 2011, there's been a tremendous increase in the amount of state issuance. And that's because of the fact that states are recognizing that using the bond market, using the debt capital markets as a source for finding revenue is actually a good and useful tool, and it's often better than looking to some of the other opportunities where the states can, where central governments can find money. Again, this is going to be the launch by the city of Dakar will be the first launch of any West African Francophone city, and it's going to be an exciting launch because it hopefully will allow a method for other leading cities to replicate that same process. But what I wanted to discuss today is not necessarily municipal finance within cities, but to talk about some of the transferable byproducts from cities to peri-urban areas. In the work that I'm doing with the city, I'm finding that the city doesn't have a strategic or long-term business plan. And I think that that's an endemic problem for many emerging market cities. Again, as I started, I said that one of the things that I like to do is to look at the issuer as not just a political unit, but as a business unit. And it's imperative to have a business plan or a long-term plan to be able to envision where you want your municipality to go. This is absolutely, in my opinion, a transferable byproduct of the bond issuance process that can go on to peri-urban areas. The development of a strategic plan where you have an identification of goals and initiatives, you have stakeholder support, and you have public participation that includes the voice of the urban poor is critical in order to encourage proper development of some of these peri-urban areas, at least in a time when these peri-urban areas are growing so rapidly. Another important transferable byproduct is the capacity building within municipal departments. We're working right now in Dakar not only on preparing for the bond launch, but in preparing the departments for an appropriate bond launch. Planning department needs to be more ready to do things. The urban management department, who actually executes a lot of the ideas that the planning department has, and most important, the financial department, needs to be ready and needs to have an understanding of debt capacity and what the debt capacity of the city is, and how to be able to predict accurately and effectively where the debt service capacity is. Again, this is something that will be a little more difficult, in my opinion, from the peri-urban perspective because the peri-urban areas are not organized into a collective unit. And in looking at finance and looking at the business unit model, there's not one identified leader who is the signatory who represents that peri-urban area. There's not one entity who will be taking out that loan or who will have the responsibility of the timely repayment of the bond. A third and important transferable byproduct is the financial capacity of the political unit. Identification of revenue sources is important, as is the predictability of the ongoing revenue sources. To know that the unit can afford to pay today is wonderful. But if you're looking at a 10-year bond or a 10-year loan, it's not just a matter of looking at that first year or looking at the first few years. It's looking at it over the lifetime of the maturity of that financial product. And without looking at the long-term vision and the long-term growth that's called for in the strategic plan, it's hard to be able to accurately predict what your revenue will be, and as a result, to predict what your debt capacity will be. And a fourth and important byproduct of the process, which I'm particularly excited by, is the objective ratings process. Even though there's been a lot of questions in recent years over whether the Moody's and the Standard & Poor's of the world are doing their job accurately and effectively, if there have been so many problems with their ratings, nonetheless, using an international ratings firm to look at the status, progress, the future of a political unit is so important to be able to identify the way that a city or political unit is performing, and particularly to be able to compare with other units within that same peer group. As I said, this will be the first bond launch in West Africa, or in Francophone West Africa. So the question is, who are the peers? And to use a local ratings firm would give a very skewed picture. Instead, using an international ratings firm that can look at the performance in Latin America, look at the performance in Southeast Asia, in other areas, other emerging markets areas, there's an opportunity to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the political unit. And one of the things that we've been particularly successful with is partnering with other international organizations that are effective in trying to bring things forward and actually executing on ideas. There's a task force within the World Bank who will help with the implementation of the ideas that are identified through the objective rating. So again, what I wanted to make sure to stress this morning was that while my experience is in municipal bond launch and bond origination, there are a lot of opportunities within the world of municipal finance that the lessons that are given can be transferred to peri-urban areas. I think that there's an opportunity here as peri-urban areas are growing and taking on different forms, as my fellow panelists have said. There's an opportunity to use the lessons that come from the municipal bond launch process and help to further guide and frame the way that we're looking at the entire peri-urban schema. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Next, we'll have Daniel Linkum, whose talk is on land management, social conflict in the city, with a special focus on Ghana.
All right, thank you very much, Caroline, and glad to be here with you. I'm not going to present anything by PowerPoint, but I want to share some thoughts with you. In our part of the world, we see land as a very important factor of production because land is perceived as not only for those who are living, but for our ancestors who are gone and those who are yet to come. And because of that, land occupies a very important place in the Ghanaian culture. If you look at the way land is managed, there are two systems of land management. A formal one that is by government, and then the traditional one that is basically owned by individuals, clans, tribes, but normally held in trust for the people by chiefs or elders. Now, if you look at the peri-urban area, you would see that most of the developments are occurring in areas where we normally refer to as stew lands. And so, because of this situation, I make three main propositions. The first proposition is that in this peri-urban space, there is a potential for growth, or that's where the potential for growth of the urban area lies. But on the other side of this potential for growth is also the potential for conflict. And as a result of that, there is the need for detailed research to see how one can manage this kind of conflict to allow citizens to be able to express their livelihood, whether it's in farming or in construction or whatever. So the first point is that peri-urban areas are potentials for growth, but at the same time, they are potentials for conflict. Conflicts in terms of disputed land ownership structures. Sometimes there are double allocation processes. There is always issues between the private and public sectors. There are issues of contested demarcations. I remember my great-grandfather, before he died, took me to his property and said, look, that's the end of your property. You see the big tree there? So what happens when tomorrow the tree is not there? So, contestations around demarcations, development of land allocated but left undeveloped for a very long time, injurious activities on allocated lands, etc., etc. So what this means is that there is a need for a discourse on how we can enhance the potentials that exist in the peri-urban areas and try and see how we can minimize the conflict, either by public government institutions or alternative dispute resolution structures or things like that. The second proposition I would make on land is that because of the nature of the change that we are observing, there are a variety of institutional, livelihood, natural resource issues which we do not fully understand. The change is so rapid and to some extent unexpected that we seem not to be prepared to be able to handle the space between the rural and the urban area. What this means is that there are implications for issues of safety, there are implications for issues of sustainability, food production, water resources, etc., etc. And these are critical issues that one needs to look at if we can guarantee the future of the urban system. And then my third proposition is that because of the pluralistic nature of land management, there is a big challenge to the old paradigm of governance, that is the public sector. And we don't seem to have an answer to the kind of mix of management systems that will allow this dualistic and pluralistic nature of land management to proceed in order to deliver benefits to the urban areas. What do all these things mean? In terms of policy, I think there are three critical issues that I would want to focus on. The first one talks about new, and my colleague talked about those things, new approaches to the urban space. And when I talk about new approaches to the urban space, we're talking about who, for example, defines the urban space, who has legitimacy, who determines what the boundary issues are, who allocates resources. And all of these are nagging questions that one has to resolve in the peri-urban interface. The second policy issue has to do with the role of stakeholders. The old paradigm where government, and I mean public authority, arrogated to itself the power to determine who lives where and who gets access to public services and facilities needs to be challenged. And I think that other stakeholders should be given space to be able to participate in what is going on in the peri-urban interface. And this morning, as we walked to this place, I was discussing with my colleague, and he was telling me about the vision of the mayor of Dakar, trying to say that, look, I'm going to get off all the street hawkers. I want to make sure the city is clean. And we allocate them. And I said, that's interesting. I would want to come to Dakar and see the day he will be successful. I think we have to wait for a millennium. So what is the role of stakeholders? Who is supposed to come to the table when it comes to discussions of ownership, when discussions of who has the right to determine what the space should be used for, etc., etc. And then my third policy intervention has to do with planning education, because I believe that the mindset with which we conceptualize the city determines the outcomes. So for instance, if I think that the city should be conceptualized as a clean place with no hawkers, then my approach to anybody who comes in will be different. It will be clear them instead of engaging with them to see what new forms of spatial social structures we can develop in the peri-urban interface. And this calls for a new attitude, a new approach to training people who would not only arrogate to themselves the power to determine what happens in the city, because as I said from the beginning, we do not yet understand all the dynamics. And as I said yesterday, we need to be humble enough to admit that there is an opportunity to learn. And I think that the peri-urban interface allows us the chance to learn and to develop new forms of urban structures that will support societies. Ghana, for example, since 2010, has more urban people than rural. And so this phenomenon, especially in secondary cities, will continue to develop as we find in many other West African cities. So we need to be humble. We need to say that we don't know, and we need to engage with all stakeholders so that we can find solutions to situations in the peri-urban areas. Thank you very much.
I'm having a very good time with my panelists. They've all come in under time, which will give us a lot of time for discussion. Our last panelist, Adnan Morshed, will present his talk on the post-marginality margin with a special focus on his research area, which is Bangladesh.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Caroline and Woodrow Wilson Center for having me. We had a wonderful discussion yesterday. It was very productive, and some of the thoughts that I will present today would, were generated yesterday. But in general, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background. I'm an architect and urban planner, and currently I'm working on a book project called Dhaka Delirium. So my alluringly called Dhaka Delirium. I wanted to share with you my Bangladesh sort of experience, and I'll be primarily talking about Dhaka, but how it affects peri-urban areas and how the sort of the destiny of peri-urban areas are intertwined inseparably with the megacity, the capital of Bangladesh, Dhaka. The way I have prepared my presentation, I'm not going to tax your brain too much. You have pretty much know the kind of the typical urban scenarios of third world cities, 30 to 50% urban population live in slum areas. You can cite Dhaka, Mumbai, Karachi. 30 to 50% people live in urban slum areas in abject conditions. So let me start here. First, Dhaka is within Bangladesh. Dhaka is seen as a dream factory. People just go toward Dhaka and in search of employment and in search of better lives. 85% of migration within the country is rural to urban, 85%. And most of these people come for economic opportunities, basically people who have lost their ancestral lands, or landless peasants who have lost their land due to river erosion, due to climate change, and land, all kinds of climate-related reasons. So they come here. Dhaka is a classic example of a primate city, which means is that Dhaka's population is more, almost double than the population of next three cities combined. So it's a one city country. The other cities are somewhere there, but it's the city that everybody gravitates to. In fact, there are about 85 universities in the country, among which 60 are located in Dhaka. So there are people coming not just for economic opportunities, but also for educational purposes, going to schools, or even healthcare. The best hospitals are there. So what happens as a result of this is that people are moving to the city en masse. There is a kind of exodus to the capital city, towards the dream factory, train launches, and all kinds of transportation systems. People are gravitating to cities. Just to give you a number, about more than 500,000 people come to the capital city each year. So you can imagine the kind of the population explosion in a decade. The country has been predominantly agrarian. What it means, this chart will show you graphically the kind of the urban population, how insignificant urban population has been even 40 years ago when the country became independent in 1971. Only 8% of the population, 8% of the total population lived in Dhaka, and 3% in other cities. So this will show you the kinds of these disproportionate distribution of population in urban areas and rural areas. These will basically just to show you that in the 1980s and 1990s, all of a sudden, the urbanization began with an accelerated pace. All of a sudden, this agrarian mindset collided with hyper-urbanization toward the late 20th century. Why? Because of number of reasons. One being cities became industrialization, a lot of opportunities in the cities, and also RMG, ready-made garments. In particular, ready-made garments brought a lot of rural women to cities. For example, in Dhaka, about 20% of the population are workers, laborers working in ready-made garment industries in peri-urban regions, the industrial belts surrounding the city. So what it means, this explosive growth, this tremendous growth of the primate city it has tremendous effect on peri-urban regions. It's basically sort of cannibalizing peri-urban areas that were formerly kind of backwater places, and so peri-urban areas are co-opted within the scope of the primate city, but without much thought on how to incorporate these cities within the legal jurisdiction of the city corporation. So there is a tremendous chaos in how to govern in terms of land governance, in terms of land use planning, sort of transportation, and all kinds of issues. There are complete chaos, and the growth is just in some ways very lopsided, if you will. So this is just to show you, this is a kind of one part of Dhaka. And so this is extreme affluence, upper middle class, and just next to it, across the lake, this is one of the largest cities. It's the sort of the Dharabi of Dhaka. You know Dharabi, in Mumbai. This is Dharabi of Dhaka, Karail slum, about more than 100,000 people living in that slum. So this is one effect of this massive number of people coming to cities. But what happens to peripheral regions? What happens to the margin? What happens to the peri-urban regions? Now, let me back up a little bit. The way I title my talk, The Post-Marginality of Margin. What does that mean? I basically try to talk about the kind of margin, the myth of margin that Janice Perlman, for example, tried to debunk about 40 years ago. So margin, from the perspective of the center, from the perspective of the metropolitan center, the margin is the other of the center. Margin is seen with apprehension. Margin is seen with some kind of fear or unknowability. So the relationship between the margin and the center has always been rather ambivalent, rather ambiguous. So when people from the margin or beyond the margin invade the city, there is tremendous pressure on land. So what I'm saying, based on my experience in Bangladesh, I have seen that there is, and I have written about it in newspapers and in my other scholarly work, that there is the future. We can easily see that a land war is coming. You know, there are all kinds of stakeholders, all kinds of people, all kinds of economic classes would lay their claim on the land. And just to give you a sense of Bangladesh's land scarcity, is the size of Iowa, but with the half of the US population crammed into Iowa. So you can see the kinds of the pressure on land. Land is actually more expensive in some places, more than gold. So land is gold. So land war is inevitable in some ways. I wanted to just show you some haunting images. This is a former peri-urban area, outskirts of Dhaka, about, let's say, 30 kilometers away, and formerly agricultural land and well-knit village communities, sort of semi-rural communities doing their things. But now, all of a sudden, because of the land pressure, lands are co-opted. And in some ways, this is the archetypal postmodern landscape where the real estate companies are taking over these former low-lying lands, agricultural lands, for not necessarily for the poor, but it's catering to, these companies are catering to the upper middle class, and not actually, I was saying yesterday, that not infusing money into local economies. Actually, it's the outsider taking hold of these peripheral regions and taking money out. So it's a very haunting situation. So if you Google, if you take any kinds of aerial impression of Dhaka or peripheral regions, this is sort of about 30, 40 kilometers outside Dhaka, and you will see, this is what you will see. These are the patches taken over by real estate companies. What I mean by post-marginality of margin is that margin is no longer about poverty, no longer about the kinds of the ambivalence with which it was viewed before. Margin is now a site of all kinds of contestations. Margin is both growth and decay. Margin is both the wasteland and also the site of growth. So it's a kind of a very ambivalent place, and as my colleagues have said, it requires new kinds of policy interventions, new kinds of calibrations, even of the mindset. I was talking about this yesterday, that Sultan Grand City, and if you look at the image, it's actually looks like Las Vegas in some ways, and the same peri-urban regions, you also get to see these kinds of images, slums, bulldozed, and so these kinds of conflicting situations occur simultaneously in peri-urban regions, and how do we really sort of, what kind of interventions are warranted? That's an open question. Again, just to show you that these kinds of housing estates are mushrooming. At the same time, the sort of the slums are also mushrooming. We see growth. We see growth, landfilling, reclaimed lands, these kinds of housing estates growing in reclaimed lands, and at the same time we see the kind of the poverty. Here, I just wanted to show you some visuals of extreme disparity. The Shanty County, the Orange County, same kinds of development in peri-urban regions. But it's not just about housing, though. Peri-urban regions have become sites of industrialization, not necessarily always with good effect. For example, in the case of Dhaka, if you go today to Dhaka from the airplane, you will see that entire city is actually cordoned off by brick fields. Brick fields making bricks. Why? Because there is a tremendous construction boom in the primate city. So the peri-urban regions have been seen by the center as sites for resource extraction. For example, these brick fields, just to give you some numbers, brick fields contribute 1% to the country's GDP, but it also contributes 39% of the primate city's pollution. And also, it's also because of the kinds of the effect of temperature in the sort of brick fields, it kills the surrounding agricultural lands. So yes, growth, it contributes to GDP, but it's also destroying the environment. And how do we actually intervene at the crucial juncture of growth and the environment? Again, land grabbing. Land grabbing has become a social epidemic. The sort of the rich, the politically influential people, the political mafia, if you will, they are grabbing lands, especially in peri-urban regions, all of a sudden, because of the price hike. So these have become a kind of a politically troubling and environmentally problematic social epidemic. Brick fields, as I was saying, these are the brick fields that sort of cordon off the city, and peri-urban regions have become the site for brick fields and boats carrying bricks. And so my point here is that peri-urban regions, while accommodating growth, but they are also, rather unfortunately, being seen by the center as sites for resource extraction, as sites, as service sites, really. So here you can see that brick fields taking bricks to the city. But where do the sort of fuel for the brick fields come from? Forests, trees. So deforestation, as the city unsustainably grows, it also creates deforestation. So there is far-reaching influence of unsustainable growth of cities. Again, these also the peri-urban regions. The water I talk about how the rivers are being not as resources, rather as dumping ground for industrial wastes and effluents. And land grabbing, rivers are encroached upon. And here, a kind of a paradigmatic example of how industries are dumping their effluents to rivers. I don't want to give you any sort of very specific, I want to leave you with some broader thoughts. The future is urban. In a country like Bangladesh or many other African countries, Nigeria or India, many other countries in the south, future is urban. In fact, let me just tell you this, that by 2030, among the top 20 megacities of the world, 12 will be in Asia. And among those 12, 5 will be in South Asia. And Dhaka is one of them, including Mumbai and Karachi. So we really have to think about this future that will be urbanized, urban. So develop sustainable urbanization policies, that's crucial. Decentralize the dream and develop mid-sized cities. I have been advocating, and in fact, about 3 months ago, one of the mid-sized cities, the popularly elected mayor of that mid-sized cities, about 40 kilometers outside Dhaka, invited a group of planners, including me, to present a vision not guided by the primate city, but a development model, a model for the future that would be somehow organic to that mid-sized city. And I was quite fascinated by that vision of the mayor. So developing mid-sized cities and somehow slowing down the flow of people toward the primate city would be crucial. And it would be crucial not just for the primate cities or also for mid-sized cities, but it also, the process will ensure human security, food security, water security, environmental security. Think about it, the unsustainable growth of cities that will demand brick fields around the city will actually kill the agricultural low-lying land, water bodies around in the country. So how do you ensure that a planning strategy that will also will take into consideration the crucial intersection between development and environmental stewardship? So capacity building, it kind of, the word kind of fascinates me. We toss around the word capacity building, but I think it would be very important to focus on problem-specific capacity building of local governments. It should be specific to the problem, not just just fiduciary capacity building, but also capacity building in terms of thinking big, thinking in terms of your own resources. So in that sense, I think capacity building would be very, very important. And also, my final thought would be rethink the intersection of growth and the environment. What kind of growth model, what kind of development model would be appropriate for the particular region? The growth model that would be good for New Mexico or Lagos may not be the growth model for Dhaka or Mumbai or Karachi. So I think the intersection of growth and the environment would be crucial for an urban future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adnan, and all our panelists who have all come in under time, giving us a lot of some time to discuss this very critical issue around the new urban spaces, these peri-urban spaces. Before I turn it to the floor, I just want to kind of raise some of the issues that our panelists have highlighted here. And I think the first one is that we're looking at a new phenomenon, one that is highly dynamic, one that is extremely fluid, and one that presents both challenges and opportunities for cities, for policymakers, and for the countries within which they're located. The second issue that our panelists raised is around questions around urban governance, and regulation, particularly without a dominant authority in these areas. The state is often present in these areas, not completely absent, but it's present alongside other local authorities, other customary or traditional authorities, even sometimes gang networks, etc. And how do we intervene in a space where there is no dominant authority? Who do we speak to? Who do we target as the agent of change? The third, of course, is how these areas are being financed. I mean, oftentimes they're outside of city boundaries. The city doesn't want to have anything to do with them, or city finances are so stretched that they can't think about provision of services in these areas. They can't, I mean, Jeremy's presentation sort of raises the issue around how in a sophisticated market you could probably raise funds, but for a city, for places that they don't have institutions, that have no authority, how do we finance these areas so that they are sustainable? And I think the key question for us here as we get into the discussion and as we think forward around how urbanization is occurring in our world is, are these areas really qualitatively different than what has come before? Are they part of a linear stage of development that becomes more formalized, as other cities elsewhere and other spaces elsewhere have shown? And finally, what are the consequences of our answers to these questions on how we intervene and the policy responses that we suggest? both as governments, as researchers, and as development agents in these areas. With those few remarks, I will open the floor and hope that we get some kind of robust discussion, questions and answers to the panelists. I would like to ask you to please identify yourselves before you ask the question. There's the gentleman.
Hello, my name is David Baxter, and I'm involved in international. Hi, my name is David Baxter. I'm involved in international development. One of the central issues that I've seen in Africa specifically are land ownership rights, and that's a big issue in peri-urban areas, and I think many of the speakers touched on that, because essentially if people have disputes over land and ownership, they're not going to make any investments in that land. You know, as a person who, if I want to build something, I'm not going to build it there if it's not my own land. If I want to build a factory as an investor, I'm not going to build it there if it doesn't belong to me. What do we I just wanted to throw to the panel the question, what are the trends that are being seen in peri-urban areas to promote land ownership and to ensure that people do have actual claims to the land before development takes place? Because you could also have land grabs, as we saw, etc., happening. That's my question.
I think we'll take a few questions and then get the panelists to respond. Did I see a hand? No. Okay, let's warm up. Oh, sorry, there's a yeah.
Joe Nelson, American University. This is a question based on experience from 30 or 40 years ago. At that time, great concern about the growth of dominant cities, primary cities, very strong interest in how to encourage medium and small cities, very much along the lines of our last speaker. I'm caricaturing somewhat, but over the next several decades, a sense that medium city strategies really weren't being very effective. So one of my questions is to Adesua Fernandez. The current growth of small and medium cities strongly affected by earlier medium city policies, or more an outgrowth of the increasing penetration of various aspects of development throughout the countryside? Possible lessons for other regions, but also a question of what is to be learned from experience with medium city strategies that might possibly be stimulating or informative for how to deal with peri-urban areas.
Michael Enders, development consultant. About 30 or so years ago, the University of Wisconsin's Land Tenure Center conducted a major study of peri-urban areas in developing countries around the world, tried to explain a bit the dynamics of it, looking at the pluses and minuses. And yet we seem to be discussing the same issues here at this point, which raises the question is, where are we going? The lack of government authority, capacity has been indicated for years and years. I would just posit that that lack of authority is there for a reason, and the reason is that many people are profiting from the present situation here. And the question whether or not these dynamics are positive or negative, I think need to be explored further. I don't think it's a completely black and white issue here as to that. And I think we need to focus more on the dynamics of the peri-urban areas rather than just looking at this problem or that problem, because there's a whole system that's been in place for years. It's expanding, it's growing larger, it may be evolving into some new characteristics, but nonetheless, it is something that has been around for quite a period of time.
Thanks. I think I'll allow the panelists to respond to that, and then we'll take another round of questions. Adisa, do you want to start?
Right. I mean, regarding your question, just a quick comment. What we see happening in the context of Latin America is that this growing penetration of real estate capital, right, the global penetration, generating record-breaking levels of value increment, property, rental, values, land values going up the ceiling everywhere, determining this process of further peripherization of the pool. Behind that, there is this international call for the homogenization of land regimes, to dispense with the existing range of other forms of legal rights over land, which regulates the social relations over land, be they customary, be they determined by, not so much in the Latin American context, but elsewhere also by religious values, right? Be they tribal or, so there's a strong call for this kind of homogenization of the legal regimes. And also in the context of the regularization of informal settlements, right? So you have a combination of policies, many of them supported by international organizations, favoring land demarcation, land registration, titling. But it seems that there's just one acceptable legal right to be considered, which is individual freehold. So there's this imposition of individual freehold as being the one and the best or the, most suitable legal right to be considered for the harmonization of land markets and regimes. And this has led not only to a total disregard, to historical, cultural, social, religious values, different values attributed by different groups of people to land and the way they establish social relationships around land, collective, not family-oriented, or, with those other sorts of values, not only the notion of property as a commodity, but also a set of land values, right? And this has also been identified in many cases as being one of the main factors determining gentrification, eviction by the market. So that's why we see that in the context of the regularization of informal settlements, more and more, as well as providing security of tenure, many programs are now also concerned about how to guarantee the permanence of the communities on the regularized, legalized, upgraded land. Highly costly investments by the public sectors, but more often than not, the beneficiaries of this intervention are not the poor. And that, to a significant extent, has to do with the kind of legal right imposed on them. This, the Hernando de Soto School of land titling, this total failure to understand that you have a set of legal political options to be considered that range from individual freehold to collective freehold to leasehold, both individually and collectively. The importance of rental housing, this is crucial, hasn't been taken on board as a significant element of a housing policy. So much as I accept that we need to do whatever needs can be done in terms of organizing the land system as well as better conditions of land administration, this doesn't mean that there's just one kind of legal right over the land, freehold, right? I mean, you look at the UK, 90% of the people don't have individual freehold. they have leaseholds. So why can't we also accept that in the context of developing countries, you have a range of forms of land occupation and ownership and other forms of risk. So I think we have to be careful with this discussion, because it leads to this imposition of a given form of legal right over the land, which is not always the best or the most suitable one from the viewpoint of the permanence of the communities on the land, right? And I fully accept that we are repeating the same discussion again. It's that in the Latin American context, it's very much a second wave of urban development, but basically marked by the same pattern of social spatial segregation, peripherization of the poor. The state authorities have had a crucial role in that, either by acting or by failing to act. The elitist nature of the planning systems, the bureaucratic nature of the urban management systems, the lack of articulation between urban housing and land policies, totally fragmented. So you try to promote territorial planning without interfering in the land structure, only determining more distortions, more problems. So we need, first of all, to have a broader, more integrated approach to land policy, articulating land, urban, housing, environmental, fiscal policies. But also we have to discuss the governance aspects of that. And one question, going back to your question on the middle-sized cities which are now growing, and even the small ones throughout Latin America, it's largely unplanned as such, right? Not that the government doesn't have anything to do with that. It's very much as a result of actions by the government, the location of infrastructure, the kind of governmental policies favoring reindustrial relocation, but also by other factors such as the search for mineral resources, the deforestation and all that. But I think one challenge that comes out of this new wave of urban development, largely informal, also around the smaller and middle-sized cities, is that we no longer believe so strongly that the decentralization of the decision-making process is the one and all, solution to that. I mean, people are now taking it with a pinch of salt. This emphasis on municipal government, on the empowerment of municipal administration has been the best way to tackle this problem. We now favor a less rigid distribution of legal powers and a more fluid system of intergovernmental articulation. There's a role for the state governments, there's a role for the national government in this definition of an articulated land framework, right? So even considering the total lack of capacity of most municipalities.
I just want to respond on Professor Nilsson's question as well, talking about medium and small-sized cities. The difference between medium and small-sized cities and the peri-urban areas from a financial perspective is that question of a lack of authority, the question of who is engendered with the responsibility or the right to enter into a long-term obligation for that peri-urban area. It's not the central government and it's not the municipal government. It's often very hard to track where the revenue is coming in from or to do any sort of accurate prediction or projection. And the other problem is that where a smaller, medium-sized city will have a central authority or a decision-making body that often doesn't exist for a peri-urban area. So with the lack of a comprehensive vision, it's difficult to identify the appropriate investment project that would need to be funded through some sort of either auto-financing, self-financing, or external financing. Thank you.
I think I would want to comment on the two issues raised. One relating to land titling and the other one relating to whether this is new at all. I think it's quite true that if you provide titles to land for people, there's the potential to be able to do quite a number of things. But I think for me the key question is to check with what assumptions we come to this conclusion. And if we check our assumptions and monitor them, for instance, there is the general belief that then there will be investment. I think yesterday we talked about things like that. Once you give somebody the title, there's a tendency for the person to invest in so many economic and productive ventures, etc., etc. But I think we need to go back and check our assumptions. Is the data showing us that this is actually happening? And unfortunately, this is not the case. So the key point for me is to make sure that we check our assumptions. The second aspect is that my colleague talked about, for example, if you look at housing, sometimes we jump to conclusions without even examining the kind of delivery mechanisms that bring about housing, for instance. I remember a discussion we had 2 years ago where we were trying to look at the issue of land values and the values of properties and all that. And a colleague who came from Germany was arguing that, you know, we need to use the rate of depreciation for calculating the value of land. I said, no, that's not right in the case of Ghana because we do incremental housing. I built my house for over 18 years, and every year the value increases. So for you to use depreciation, it's wrong. It's a wrong premise. So I think that we need to constantly interrogate the underlying assumptions with which we do some of the calculations and we transport for us to pick. Then on the question of whether this is new, I think that if we said that this is new, it would be simply academic suicide. But I think we don't understand the dynamics. And like you rightly said, for me, if we would only monitor how things are happening in the peri-urban area and try and track what are the interfaces, what is happening, who is who, what are the mechanisms, how are people surviving, how come we say things don't work but people still live. And if we're able to track these things, I think that in itself provides us with a basis to say, yes, we understand. And if we understand, then we can begin to offer some suggestions, no matter how modest they may be. So I think that we don't have to pretend as if it's new. It is not. But how is it happening? Is it different from the waves that have happened before? Can we track the dynamics? Can we see the people who are the key stakeholders? Who are they? Where have they come from? What are their interests? How do they intermingle with others? And what forms of productive ventures arise out of these interactions? And I think once we are able to do that, then we can begin to say we understand the system, so then we can offer some modest recommendations.
So I think we have covered pretty much everything about why mid-sized cities haven't grown or what's the current discourse and so on. But I would actually like to focus on Bangladesh to explain why mid-sized cities in Bangladesh have not grown or have not developed. I identify a number of forces or number of shortcomings. One, the most crucial is the centralization of political power. And the primate city becomes so much affiliated with the political power and consolidation of political power that any kinds of distribution of power in other areas of the country becomes politically untenable. So it also, the problem is also related to a perceptual problem that growth happens if you are in the center of political power. If you are in that region, you will make it. So I think there is a kind of a pervasive perceptual problem that kind of impedes the growth of other cities. So it's that consolidation of political power and perceptual problem. This other issue is the lack of communication infrastructure. So what it happens is that pretty much the communication infrastructure surround the primate city, even from the north to south. If you want to go from the north to south, you'll actually have to go via the capital city. There is no direct route. So there is a kind of this, by means of the communication network that kind of haphazardly grown over the years, in the past 20 years or so, it kind of natural propensity is to gravitate to the capital city. I think that's one crucial problem. The other is the what I would call the illusion of the power of local governments. There has been a lot of political discussion, there has been a lot of political debates about how to empower the local government. It's a dominant political discourse without much actual implementation and content. So the illusion, lately a kind of a change has been transpiring, which is the kind of the non-political election platform for the mayor. So the mayors are not politically handpicked or not politically appointed. So these non-political platform for the mayoral election has been sort of effecting some changes in the way local governments making their strategies. I think, so we see some hope, that mid-sized cities, especially, when this mayor in the mid-sized city outside Dhaka, she has been popularly elected, and her election, unlike before, has been a national headline. And because the whole country was paying attention, that finally a local government election is making some changes in the political discourse. So when she invites, and also there's a gender element, it was a she, and it kind of was a kind of an interesting twist to the dominant political discourse. So when she invited us, three planners, including me, the first thing that really fascinated me was that we want something, a vision of our own. We don't want something imported from the capital city. I think that made it, that sort of summed up the kind of this political, a kind of a resistance of this political asymmetry that has been plagued the sort of the political narrative. So I think these are, this is a hopeful sign, but I think we'll see emerging realities of mid-sized cities.
Thanks very much. The gentleman.
I would like to posit that the dynamics of the peri-urban areas are quite different in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and particularly West Africa, which we're talking about. And it would be interesting if researchers here would exchange notes and try to identify the commonalities and the differences in those dynamics, which would help understand and move forward the discussion.
Do we have any questions? Yes, Patricia.
Patricia?
Patricia Fagan, Georgetown University. I seem to be sitting in a little nest of people with long historical memories, which delights me. But harking back to what Joe Nelson said about urban planning, or the wisdom of urban planning some 30 years ago, and Michael, I don't know about the land tenure studies of marginal areas, peri-urban areas, I forget what they were called then, but but I do remember the study somewhat. There was also a debate that Adnan has reiterated, and that is how marginal are marginal people who live in marginal areas. And as Adnan says, they're not really marginal to capitalism. They can be at the center of capitalist development, the brickworks. They just happen to be in the losing end of it, but they're central to it. My image of peri-urban areas is that for the most part, they are full of people who are in the informal sector economically and in terms of employment. Please shoot me down on this, because I only know a certain number of cities, but that in the main, such people work informally and they don't have regular jobs, regular salaries, regular pensions, or anything like that. Of course, that's true of Europe today too, but never mind. So I wonder if in any of the research that any of you have done, has the informality of employment been a factor that you've considered in terms of thinking about how integration might a more integrated strategy might take place?
Thanks. I think I'll scramble it up now. Maybe, Adnan, do you want to respond to?
Yeah, I could briefly. So the question was, how do we integrate the informal sector employments of the margin or peri-urban areas into the? How do you take that into account? I think that's a crucial question, and so I think it has to be related with land governance and giving them, without sort of talking about all the standard jargon, give them some right and give them some kind of security of employment, security of life. And that will, I mean, for example, in the case of Dhaka again, the 40% of the service sector, the people working in the service sector are, low-end service sector, people are 40% of them are in slum areas. So interestingly, the slums or squatter settlements inside the city are patronized by the industrialists because they provide cheap labor very quickly and readily, and they basically walk to factories and in the sort of the outskirts of the city or wherever. So giving them some kinds of some kinds of regularize and some kinds of tenure, land tenure, some kinds of, I think, creating some sense of security so that they would be brought into the larger the production system. I think that we have to think about it.
Well, I think that for me, it's also a perception issue. Many of us urban planners, city managers, really do not know what our cities look like. And we fail to understand that many times it is about 80% informal. And then we try to put in measures to remove informality. It wouldn't happen. Because if you understand the texture of your city, you know that it is 80% informal. Why would you want to take people out of the streets? That's the nature of the city. So I think that we need to be able to understand what we are dealing with and deal with what is rather than what we want to see. And for me, I think that is very crucial. And that comes back to your point that what it means is that we need to really factor them into envisioning what kind of city we would want to see. But unfortunately, I mean, I was discussing with my colleague as we walked towards this place. In the city of Accra, which is the capital, in Kumasi, there's a terminology in our local language which translates as, leave it to boil, it will cool down. You know, we try removing street hawkers, 1 month, 2 months, good action. They'll just look at you, sometimes even with the military, and then after 2 months, they come back to the streets. So I think we need to understand the texture of our cities. And if we begin to appreciate that it is informal, then we begin to ask ourselves, how can we then incorporate these informal operators so that we can have a vision of the city with them and not without them? And I think the second point I wanted to make is that sometimes there is the assumption that we have to formalize the informal. But who tells us that when we formalize the informal, it will give us the picture that we want to see? So I think it goes back to the kind of assumptions that we hold, which we do not check. Is it always the case that when the city becomes formal, everything becomes okay and we live happily ever after? Or is it possible that we can allow informality to allow us to express ourselves? So I think these are key issues that we need to grapple with. But I obviously believe that we need to take them into account.
And I think that an additional way potentially to take them into account is, and this is what I'm working on specifically right now in Dakar, is to engage, and this is within a city, but I think that this is a transferable idea, to engage the urban poor in the dialogue on strategic planning. To just take a top-down approach and to assume that the mayor or that the local political leaders sitting in a room will necessarily know what the needs and demands are for the informal sector is not truly representative. And the best way to get that, to get to the crux of it, would be not only to have these high-level approaches, but to find ways to incorporate them, implicate them in the decision-making, and to make them feel like they have an ongoing role in the dialogue.
Right. In the Latin American context, and especially considering the most consolidated, more established informal settlements, this relationship between informal housing and informal work is no longer that clear, right? I mean, we have very interesting data suggesting, as I mentioned before, that the rates of informal development have been higher than the rates of urban development and the rates of poverty growth, right? I mean, as a combination of a number of factors determining economic development in many countries, the social policies that have been implemented in Brazil and elsewhere. So you have a new socio-economic configuration in many countries, but the land problem remains. So if you look at the socio-economic profile of people living in the more central, more established, more consolidated informal settlements, you see that quite a lot of them do have formal jobs, right? Many of them university lecturers, civil servants, and all that, who can't afford to live legally in central areas in a different way. So, so this is crucial. If you look also at the analysis of an evaluation that has been made of the Peri-Urban regularization program, the almost 2 million titles which were given by the government to people living in informal settlements with the promise that they would have automatic access to credit. And the findings clearly show that there's no clear link or between titling and access to credit, especially in order to offer the property as collateral and all that. But there has a link between formal jobs and access to credit. And a lot of people living in informal settlements did have formal jobs. So they had access to credit, not because they had land titles, but because they had a job. So, only to show that there's more to informal development than poverty, right? And that's why we have to tackle the existing conditions of the land administration system as a whole. So going back to your question, I think African, Asian, Middle Eastern cities should look at Latin America because, we are them tomorrow in many ways, right? So again, some experiences are more sophisticated, some countries are more integrated into the broader global economy than others, but deep down, all the new peri-urbans, they are very much reflections of the same process of land development. They are expressions of a market-led, informally and formally market-led development in which the state authorities have had a major role indirectly, directly, by acting, by failing to act. So if we are to choose one aspect that should be discussed and understood in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, is the importance of land for this equation, and to articulate land policy with housing policies, with economic policies, with environmental policies, instead of the traditional fragmented approach. And also the importance of a legal institutional framework to deal with that. So basically, two main concepts: the notion of property rights, what it means, who has it, and who has the power to intervene in the domain of property rights, be they private, public, or communal, customary, or religious, or whatever. And on the other hand, who has this power? Is it the local level, the regional level, the national level? What kind of articulation mechanisms? How does the private sector participate in that? How can we involve the community sector? How can we enable also a higher degree of popular participation, including in the allocation of public resources, the participatory budgeting processes implemented in so many cities. So this combination of land and governance, this land governance framework is perhaps the main lesson that Latin America has to offer to African, Asian, and Middle Eastern countries, I think.
Do we have any other questions?
I'm Eric Painter, Department of Defense. I was very engaged with the issue of authority and the conflicts of authority. And I'm also influenced by there's a recent UN study that looks at urbanization out to 2025. And I think it claims that there'll be like 38 megacities by 2025. But can any of you envision a situation where a megacity or dominant city or a primate city gains a functional autonomy from the national government? Or where a situation where you have national and municipal authority kind of commingled, or if a city will come to dominate the country as a whole.
The gentleman.
I'm Andrea Herzog from the World Bank Institute. I think adding to your point that it's important to make clear the difference between the regions, I think also for the table to explore the difference between the stages of urbanization. I think that's really important. I mean, Latin America, as Adesio was saying, with 80% urbanized region, Brazil 84, compared to South Asia, which levels are much lesser, 30 and 40%. I mean, there are different patterns and trends that you can see. Latin America, clearly, I mean, the metro areas are growing slower because of reasons that, as you mentioned, and the smaller cities, middle cities growing faster compared to South Asia. So, and Africa is another reality altogether. So I think that's an important thing. And one lesson, I think, now we are saying more and more, and I'm from Brazil too, so we should look to Brazil a lot for the mistakes we have done. I mean, we are doing a large upgrading projects that are really expensive right now because exactly we couldn't intervene early enough to manage the peri-urban growth and to direct it. I mean, there are some examples already in Africa which is being done, and the cost of serving those informal areas is much lower when you act much earlier than when you act later. So just a little bit of attention to when we look to the experience from different countries and cities to understand where they are in urbanization, what kind of policies are more suitable for the stage of urbanization they are.
I'm half Brazilian by means of my beginning my dissertation on Brasilia, which I gave up after 4 months because of all kinds of issues. So I'm half Brazilian.
And also a football lover.
The first question here how to imagine a scenario where the central government is somehow politically outside the scene of the primate city governance. That was sort of you were referring to. I think that would be an ideal situation, and there have been attempts in the case of Bangladesh. There have been attempts to empower the mayor, almost like in the sense of New York, let's say Giuliani or Bloomberg having some autonomy, so much so that the decisions are made very organically, if you will. So there have been attempts, but I think what hobbles that possibility in Bangladesh is the pervasive culture of political loyalty. So even the mayor with the myth of autonomy mayor who runs the city corporation, the political loyalty comes in the way of urban governance. So I think that would be ideal when two are separated, and but the illusion or the sort of this extreme centralization of political power is such that that becomes a dream. So I think, but there are hopeful signs. The kind of as I earlier said, that the election of the mayor from non-politically aligned platform is beginning to open up some space where autonomy of urban governance has a better chance.
I think I have 2 points, and I want to start with the idea of a local government strong enough to stand alone. My mind goes back to PL 164, which is a title of a course I took in 1982, History of Settlements. And one of the things that the lecturer emphasized at the time was that people started agglomerating together for purposes of defense. And that brings my mind to the fact that, yes, you may be very strong, but there are certain points where you may need outside help. So I think that in terms of becoming autonomous, there is a limit. And I would favor a situation where you know where you stand, a kind of a shared responsibility and maintaining a balance. I think one of the good books, if I'm right, maybe it's the Bible, says that a false balance is an abomination. So I think you need to be able to look at the fact that you cannot do it alone, and you may have to, at a point in time, call on the services of central government to be able to deal with some issues. So that's how I see it. And then I believe that we may experiment with it, but I wouldn't want my city to be the one that starts with that experiment.
I'm also thinking of different examples from my African experiences, and I was surprised to see that there are some cities where the leadership is not popularly elected at all, that it's almost a puppet of the central government. When I took a study tour to Douala to learn about the Cameroonian experience as far as bond issuance, they issued a bond in 2005 that was technically correct, but had led to a number of problems for the municipal officials who were participating. Some of them, I think, are still in jail today, 7 years later. And it showed me that the idea of having the central government being so pervasively involved in the activities of the city, for a lot of reasons, was not ideal. From a financial perspective, it would require the unwinding of certain constructs within a lot of the African countries. For example, Nigeria has over, I think, 24 different sub-sovereign states, not cities but states, and those states, when they issue bonds, and I think 60 or 70% of them have successfully issued bonds, all of those bonds are directly guaranteed by the central government, which means that the central government has an enormous role in looking to make sure even that the bond issuance is something that those lesser entities can afford as far as a debt service capacity. So I see that as being a stumbling block in really encouraging an autonomous city. Looking at the city of Dakar, it's a fluid arrangement between the city and the sovereign government. With the recent election of a new president, there's hope and I think everybody anticipates that there will be devolution of some of the powers from the central government back to the city that had been taken from the city in the first place under the previous regime. So I think that there are opportunities, but as Dan said, I don't think that anybody wants to be the first to try it.
Yeah, I think one recurrent problem that we have throughout Latin America is that the legal political institutions in force do not express the true nature of the urban territorial processes as well as the socio-economic processes determining them. Right? To take Brazil, for example, Brazil is said to be the most decentralized federal state in the world, with local government having a range of fiscal, legal, political, and administrative powers, large as a result of this strong belief during the democratization process in Brazil that by decentralizing, by devolving power, by recognizing the autonomy of local government, we'd also be promoting democracy. These days, people see that it's not necessarily the same thing, right? So basically, what we have is a system in which this emphasis on municipalities, local government, fails entirely to recognize the nature of the urbanization process, which more often than not is one of metropolitanization. So there's no way you can deal with matters such as sanitation, transportation, housing, and all that only from the viewpoint of the local government, or even a combination of actions of a few local governments. You need a more integrated, often regional approach. If you add some environmental dimension into that, you have to at least consider the level of the river basins. So how can you tackle that only from the viewpoint of a specific local administration? So that aggravated further by the widespread lack of capacity of local administrations. So just to finish, in Brazil at the moment, we have the two most significant public policies in the history of Latin America, which are the My House, My Life housing program and the plan to accelerate growth. A gigantic amount of money has been given by the federal governments to municipalities who can't formulate projects, who can't monitor them, who can't control them. So together with inefficiency, duplicity, irrationality, corruption, what we see happening is an enormous amount of money being sent back to federal government, even by municipalities such as São Paulo, because of their lack of capacity to act. So money is no longer the problem. So this crisis of the legal, political, institutional system, the lack of a proper framework is crucial. It needs to be tackled more than ever because, the amount of wasted money at the moment and also the confirmation. Just to give you the example, the housing program implemented by the municipalities in Brazil with federal money, because of this failure to intervene in the land structure, we have these gigantic housing projects being built in the periphery of the periphery, very much in the way Mexico has been doing it and Chile has been doing it. So a wasted opportunity to promote social-spatial integration.
Thank you very much for attending this session. I think the point that we've been talking about peri-urban spaces for a long, long time is well taken. But like discussions around slums, the informal sector, we thought that these were all anomalies that were going to eventually be transformed into a formal city. And I think what we're seeing right now is a scale and a rate of growth that really has turned on its head what we understand as the city. These are the cities. Cities are the informal sector. They're the slums. They're the peri-urban spaces. And I think, again, the point is well taken that we need to understand across these continents how these different dynamics are playing out and what kinds of interventions we need to address some of the challenges they pose. I want to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. And perhaps Blair, our host, will say goodbye.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and just in response to the observations that we need research, we need a discussion among regions. That's exactly what this group has been about, and we hope that we'll be able to continue it, and we'll let everybody here know what the next steps are as we take them. So thank you for coming.
Good chair.
You can go home.
Of June. Of here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So